Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, just real simple question: Why run for mayor now? Obviously, you've been Undersecretary of DoD.
Of the Air Force, not the whole DoD.
Yeah,
Undersecretary of the Air Force. That's right.
Of the Air Force. Thank you. But Undersecretary of the Air Force, you ran for Congress, really close race, and then and now here we are running for mayor. So why this seat? Why now?
Look, I am very thankful of the ways in which the community that raised me allowed me to grow up healthy, get an education, and serve our country. And I look forward to bringing my service, my leadership, to making sure that those folks, young folks, just as talented, frankly, just as ambitious, just as hungry as I was at one point, have those same opportunities. I think it's also really important, given the opportunities in our community, that we have somebody that's got a strong record of leadership and management. As the Undersecretary, I managed a $173 billion budget, led 600,000 folks. And so I look forward to bringing that service and that leadership and service to my hometown. I must also say, as an Air Force veteran, as an Iraq War veteran, I think also the moment in time that we're in calls for a certain kind of leadership that can think about certainly moving our community forward, our city forward. And as I point on my website, there's no time to waste. Because I think, look, even if we had a different president, we'd still have the fact that over half of the kids in our community are not reading at level, their math skills are not at level. We'd still have 95,000 working families that are housing insecure, right, based on the city's own numbers. And we'd have on top of that, we would still have 67,000 people that are on the wait list to Opportunity Home. So these are, I think, challenges that we have talked about for a very long time, these longstanding inequities in our community. I think it's important that we have the leadership that is going to work in collaboration, certainly with the rest of the city council, as well as the rest of the city staff, to make sure we've got real progress on these things, and not down the road, but immediately, right? And that's why on my website, I put on there the 14 things I would focus on, well, 6 priority areas, 14 action items that I would focus on in the first 100 days, right? That focus on increasing supply of housing that is affordable. Looking at, again, if we really wanted to take a hard look at, for example, something like paying the full bill for pre-K for SA. What is the full number of kids we are not serving currently? What is that bill? And then as we have conversations about major investments in our community, we're also taking a hard look at investing in the real infrastructure that we know is important for the long-term economic security of our community, which is strong, smart, healthy kids, right? I think it's also really important as we have, for example, a generational investment downtown, right, potentially, that we are focused on making sure that our community gets a good deal. That's why on first 100 days, I want to make sure that we are really relooking the non-disclosure agreement policy. I think that's very important. Frankly, as you all know, you all have pushed to make sure we have the very limited information we have until this point, and it was nice to finally see some public information at that November City Council meeting. But I think a multi-billion-dollar project to have gone on for that long without public input, without public oversight, is not acceptable, right? So we need to look at that policy to make sure that we are, and is there a role for non-disclosure agreements, NDAs? There may be, right? Having worked in the intelligence community, there's a way in which you protect information, but also make sure the decision makers who need it, I would argue voters and taxpayers, have access to that information. And as I talk to voters all across the community, this is one of those issues that comes up pretty often, because people can very easily for themselves look at the promises around the Alamo Dome, right? We did not get an NFL football team, despite I think what the mayor at the time was sharing and selling. They can also very easily look at the Frost Center and Nelson Wolff actually, I think, shared it on your podcast, or I'm not sure who exactly, but it was on a podcast, where he said, the deal that he negotiated was the Spurs would give 20% of their profits every year in exchange for that. He said, ask me how much we got over 20 years. 0, right? On top of those folks on the east side, rightly very concerned about what's going to happen to their community now, on top of the broken promises for economic development that never came to their communities. So I think it's fair that we ask the tough questions about, how do we ensure this time, if this move forward, that San Antonio gets a good deal in light of the generational challenges that we have, as I mentioned, frankly, the state of the inequities in our community, but also the challenges among our young people.
A number of your opponents obviously sit on city council. Ron was on city council. Ivy was on city council. Julian was on city council. So I think you see where I'm going with the question you don't have, you have a very impressive background, but you don't have municipal elected experience, right? So to go from no experience at the municipal level to, the mayor of the city, how are you going to handle that? How do you address that concern that there's a lived experience gap, say, in terms of taking on city hall politics, wrangling 6 votes, making sure people's potholes are filled, dealing with arena discussions, all of that.
Yeah, well, look, I'm very proud of my service to our country. I'm proud of having led a very large bureaucracy, and there are a lot of parallels in how bureaucracies function. I think at the end of the day, though, it's about leadership, and it's about producing results, and I certainly have a record of that. Again, managing a $173 billion budget, a multi-cycle budget, right, not just a one-year budget, and having done that in concert with department leads in the same way that you would do that with the city staff, not only for the yearly budget, but also in the context of what the bond looks like, right? But look, my job as the undersecretary really boiled down to asking 2 questions literally every single day, which is 1, do my people have what they need to be successful, right? And 2, are we making smart investments? And I would argue those are fundamentally the questions a mayor has to ask. We don't have endless resources, and certainly the climate shows that we are going to be fighting for additional resources in an era where our community is already struggling. The Department of Education, if that were to go away, the number of Title I schools in our community, I myself, every school that I went to, Adams Hill Elementary School, Pease Middle School, John Jay High School, all Title I schools, right? My mom taught at Harlandale High School for 25 years. So really unique, kids with special needs, by the way. So uniquely understand the ways in which some of these attacks on things that are so foundational to our today, as well as our long-term economic security, what that means for our community. So I think, the leadership that I bring, the management that I bring, the ability to deliver results, but I would also add courage, right? And I say that because I find it unacceptable in the same way that you do, as I have read your articles on Project Marvel, the fact that there has not been nearly enough public input, public discussion about this generational investment, right? Not only in terms of the deal today, but again, in light of the track record and lack of promises kept on those. And so I am, in fact, while I might not have been in city council, I am the only one that has talked about proposing a solution that would help rectify the circumstance that created it, so that for over a year this was going on, potentially multi-billion-dollar project, no accountability. Now I would argue, those folks on city council right now, they are exactly in the position to talk to the city manager, talk to the city staff and say, hey, how did we get here? What is the information that you're looking at? What have you done? What exactly is going on here? I think we're all a little bit shocked when some of these elected officials themselves are finding out at the same time that normal voters, normal folks are finding out about it. So I think there needs to be a rectifying in terms of understanding to whom ultimately we are all accountable, right? And that is to voters, right? City staff works with city manager works for the city council. City council, we would all work for the people. So I'm the only one that has said, first 100 days, let's look at that NDA policy. Let's make sure that we've got a policy that makes sense, that we are all on board with, and everybody clearly understands. Because, look, transparency leads to accountability, and accountability leads to trust. Right?
So if you're elected, the number 1 top issue for you would be?
So for me, it is housing affordability. It's interesting, based on who I talk to, let me just say this, because there are certain communities that are frankly feeling the pressure of these times. Let me just say that in a different way, right? I was just, for example, with members of my LGBTQ community, and I asked them that exact same question: what's your number 1 issue? I hear it. Is it housing affordability? You can't buy a home. Is it childcare? What is it? They said honestly, it's like, I'm worried about my existence, right? I'm worried about my existence. And so I think it's important as a leader to recognize that not everybody is feeling these current times or not everybody feels as secure as others in our community. I think that's really important for any leader to understand, so that when we are coming up with solutions, we are considering the unique ways that the ways in this administration, as well as the state government, how those laws are disproportionately impacting certain people, right? But I think in the interim, in that near term, housing affordability comes up quite a bit, right? Which is why first 100 days, I want to look at, hey, how can we go faster on some of these things? The latest bond included just 4,000 units for affordable housing. That is not nearly going to cut it for, as mentioned, the 95,000 housing insecure families, as well as the 67 on the wait list. So we've got to go faster in that way. I think it's also really important, though, that I would be honestly most proud if we were able to get pre-K for SA fully funded. This, I think, is a generational opportunity. We talk a lot about the inequities. I mean, everybody by this time has probably read the Mimi Schwartz article, right, that has laid all this out very clearly. We know where the highest rate of return is, and it is when you want to invest in people, and it's always as far left as possible. And so I would argue you probably wouldn't need so much ready to work if you had more pre-K for SA, right? We're not going to obviously dictate what the school districts do and to in any way, but we can impact the quality that goes into the public school system, and I would argue you do that with pre-K for SA.
What do you mean when you say fully funded?
So I want to know how many kids are we currently not serving, right, based on the circumstance. There's only 4 units right now, right? So we only meet a fraction of the need. So how much talent are we leaving on the table? How many bodies is that? And then what is the bill if we wanted to meet that? Like those 2 very simple questions. We don't have those answers now, so it's really hard to have a discussion about, what the bill looks like. But we know if there are kids that are underserved or unserved, then there's a bill to pay, right? Because they should be served.
So it'd be the 4 centers, and then what's offered at all the districts?
First off, we need to understand, that's the how. Let's first understand what the scale of the challenge is, right? So let's understand what the gap is first, and then there are different ways to do this. You might have a totally new pre-K for SA center in some places, but you might be able to actually also maybe augment in certain areas. For me, I would be less concerned most concerned with how quickly can we meet the need, which is why on the first 100 days, I also want to look at how quickly might we be able to repurpose some of those recently closed schools to pre-K for SA centers or for childcare centers, right? They're already kind of outfitted for that based on what they previously did. And we know that's a great need in our community. I think it's also important, having served as the Undersecretary of the Air Force and our city's great pride in being Military City USA, that we understand the importance of these investments in the context of us being competitive for military missions moving forward, right? Folks will remember in, I think it was 2019, where we did not compete well for a space-related headquarters. And one of the things we got dinged on was childcare. And I remembered that because then when I got to the Pentagon, this is also the issue I heard about the most from our young airmen and guardians. Not surprising when you look at who is actually serving. And then actually worked with my team because I wanted other senior leaders who had not necessarily thought about this as an operational readiness issue to understand the impacts of us not having nearly enough childcare. So our not an audit team, but they were kind of a data analysis team. They did a study and they found that if a female service member already has 1 child on the wait list, if she becomes pregnant again, the likelihood of her separating increases by 3 times, right? So that was very clear. The data showed us how this was actually impacting our ability to keep talent, right? And when you look at that, that's also kind of that mid-career, which is so important, right? Because ultimately then you can look at later on where you don't have talent. Well, it's because people left at a certain time. So, again, I will always start with the data, right? Understanding that is how we can make sure that we're looking at it as complete as possible and not making assumptions. So I say all that because the things that actually are good for military families and help us be competitive for military missions also happen to be good for San Antonio families, right? And it just in general helps keep us competitive, assuming the matrix, the rubric for determining where future military missions also go. I will also, let me just say this, got me started now on Military City USA. I think it's really important that, if San Antonio doesn't get some of these things right, the clear impact that it has on the country's national security. I mean, everybody knows the number one reason why somebody will serve is if they know somebody who has served, right? So it's actually only a handful of communities, and Bexar County being one of them, that disproportionately sends people to serve, right? And so if we don't have healthy enough kids, academically prepared enough kids, it is in fact a national security issue just because we contribute so much to that pipeline.
I can keep going, or
Sure, I'll go in. I've been asking this to everyone. So one of the big things that the mayor gets to be is an ex officio member of the SAWS and CPS boards of directors or trustees, whatever they call them. And so from the SAWS perspective, how well do you think San Antonio, or SAWS, and San Antonio by extension, is doing or not doing at safeguarding its water supply, particularly the Edwards and Trinity aquifers? And I say that in particular light of what's happening in Guadalupe Ranch with the permit, the discharge permit that's under consideration there, the discharge into Lewis Creek. So that's the water side. On the electricity side, the excess revenue that CPS throws off as a result of selling excess energy on the market after it's taking care of its customers' needs is, pretty much annual debate as to whether that should be kicked back to customers as rebates or plowed into investment, into transmission lines, which we're in need of, other new forms of energy to keep up with demand, or for the general fund. I guess some people argue that, although not that many. So if you could, take one at a time, the SAWS matter and the CPS matter.
Yeah.
Those things the mayor gets to be.
Sure. Well, look, I would, again, be guided by the data and understanding by 2040 we're supposed to be the size of Chicago, right? So I would want to understand kind of how well are we right now positioned to meet what that population growth would look like and demand, and then use that to inform, how we make investments, but also the kinds of deals that we make with companies that want to come here, data centers, for example, that are huge utilizers of our energy, but don't necessarily bring a lot of jobs with that. I would also think about this, though, in the context of some of the challenges that we currently have as it relates to public health, right? The number one reason why kids in Texas miss school, asthma, right? So I would be thinking about energy also in the context of, cleaner air, healthier kids, right? It's just big picture. When it comes to CPS, I was just doing this before I got here, 27% of the general fund is made up by CPS Energy, second only to current property taxes. As I understand, CPS is quite innovative, and I think that's kudos to the leadership there. Again, making sure though that we are not necessarily putting a heavier load on our residents, and making sure that we're really looking at what is the contribution of commercial entities so that we can continue to make smart investments in green energy and those types of things, as well as not, frankly, overly burdening our residents when we think again about the ways in which corporations might be able to pay a higher percentage of that. On the SAWS piece, when I hear things like 20% of water we lose to leaks, I'm very concerned about that. I would want to understand, and I understand that is a big bill, right? That we just kind of keep kicking the can on, but we are going to run out of places to kick the can. So I think it's really important that we, as a mayor, in concert with the city staff and the city council, understand this is not any one person's problem or organization's challenge, really, because it's going to take community resources to make those investments. I think when you talk about the water supply, yes, I don't know if enough residents in San Antonio understand just how much we pay to counties to the west of us, right, to help them not develop over the recharge zone so that we can have that supply. So we are going to pay, and look, the supply from Vista is good, but when we are losing 20% of our water to leaks, like that's not smart, right? So we've got to fix the infrastructure, again, understand what that bill bill looks like, how we might be able to pay for that, as well as look at some very real conservation efforts that we probably should just be doing anyways.
Just to follow up on Tony's two questions.
Yep.
So specific to CPS Energy, every year there seems to be some kind of additional revenue. All of a sudden it's 40 million or 28 million or whatever. If you were mayor and let's say there's a surplus of revenue, do you have a specific vision of what you would do with that? Let's just hypothetically say it's $50 million out of the sky. Here it is, right?
Which is ballpark, which we
Yeah, which has happened, right? Roughly 40 million or something like that. Would you want that to go back to ratepayers, like directly? Would you want to put that into infrastructure to better serve energy demand? Just give us a sense of how you would prioritize a hypothetical like that.
Yeah, well, how I would prioritize it is I'd certainly like to hear from CPS in terms of what are some options for those investments, and certainly if there are investments that we have been deferring, for which maybe investment would be ripe and make sense. On top of, it's always, I think, important to also recognize kind of the needs within the community and what might be the right balance to also help with rate payment there. But I think, again, my North Star is going to be, we know where we're going as a community. We're growing very quickly. So what is the highest ROI? And some of that's qualitative, some of it's a quantitative discussion, but making sure that we're balancing our long-term needs with some of the short-term needs in the community.
Specific to the water question that Tony raised, on Guajolote Ranch, do you have a specific position on that? Because the concern is that if that permit's if it's approved,
the wastewater
into treated, but basically into the aquifer.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get a sense. We're trying to get a sense of if you were mayor right now, how would you approach the situation, right? Would you?
Well, I would do everything in my power, and working with the city staff, and certainly working with our legal team to understand, what is the maximum amount of pushback to be able to prevent that from happening. I mean, wastewater potentially in our water source is not an acceptable outcome.
Just sticking with CPS real quick, recently the utility has shuttered coal plants. Give us your sense of do you picture coal as being any part of our power mix, and what types of energy sources would you want to champion, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think it's great that, a lot of what we would champion is right here in Texas, right? Solar, wind, a lot of that comes from West Texas. In terms of the mix for coal, look, I think we've got to make sure that we are investing in those things that are clean for the environment, but also allow us to transition in a way that is cost effective and not. If you can't pay the bill overnight, then you've got to make sure that you are chipping away and moving in the direction that you want to. So what I would need is a kind of a more fulsome understanding from CPS in terms of what the transition looks like, where we might be able to go faster in light of the circumstances and in the opportunities that may exist that maybe didn't exist at the time they developed the transition plan, to be able to better answer that question.
So one of our survey questions about pre-K for us.
Love it.
So you've already answered it. Is whether or not you support it. It sounds like you support it.
100%. This is an investment we cannot afford to not make. The risks of continuing to have over half of the kids in our community not reading at level, their math skills not at level. It's inexcusable that this solution that we know of exists and we are not fully funding that. This is the greatest investment I think we could make, and we should make it as soon as possible.
What about Ready to Work?
Ready to Work. Look, I think Ready to Work is a perfect example of a program that demonstrates that San Antonio's heart is in the right place. Sometimes our execution, though, can be improved upon. And that's fair, right? It was a very difficult time during COVID. We had resources. We knew the needs in our community, and so we tried to address that. And I think I commend folks who tried to do that. I think now when we look at the data, there's some room for improvement. And this is on the website, when you tell me 25% of the folks that have gone through that program are still not in an approved job 12 months after completing the program, that means we are not training people to needs in our community. Right? We have got to, again, look at the needs in our community, because look, if ideally you have somebody walk into a job, right? So I think the new metric should be 90% of the folks in an approved job within 90 days. That shows that you're training people to need. I actually went to go talked to Randy Bullis, who runs the Community Health Care Professionals program down on the South Side. They've got 2 campuses, but he's on the South Side. And they are training those folks, med techs, your farm techs, your billing, your admin, those folks that help run the clinic. They're not the nurses, but they make that clinic work, right? And he told me, he's like, the average student here is a 26-year-old Latina, a couple of kids. 40% of those folks started at Palo Alto or Northwest Vista at community college, and then it just didn't work out, right? So now this is kind of their path to something better. And of the Ready to Work folks, though, the 7,300 is the amount of their Pell Grant that they receive to be able to go through that program. And they obviously are very happy with the Ready to Work program because of the child care that it affords. So those Ready to Work students have child care and the Pell Grant, the other students don't. But they are creating a pipeline in our community that is so sorely needed, right? The med techs just in our community, I think the need is 1,500 a year is what, if I remember Randy correctly, between their North Campus and their South Campus, they only produce 300, right? So there's still quite a bit of a gap there. And so I think that's a perfect example of, how can we help this go faster in light of the needs in our community? You're not going to AI your way out of, drawing blood, right? Not that we know of yet. So how can we really look at the data? Where are people very successful? I would argue in Ready to Work, though, we also need to look at a couple of things. We need to make sure there's some requirement that people stay in San Antonio. As I talk to city council folks familiar with that program, we lose people to Houston. We should not be paying people to Ready to Work in Houston. I would also argue we should stop paying private multi-million-dollar corporations to upskill their own people. That is not how that program was sold to voters. And the fact that the numbers are what they are, even in light of that subsidized professional development, shows you we've got some real work to do with that program. But again, I'm not saying do away with it. I'm saying let's look at the data. How can we improve it? Because it's so critical. I would argue, though, again, the highest ROI is always going to be as early as possible at a young person, pre-K for SA.
You bring up childcare. There is already in the works effort for the crisis nursery. Are you aware of that, or do you know what that is? Just before, it's essentially at the most extreme level a domestic violence situation where a parent, mostly mom, can drop off the child temporarily and be in their community. It's already in the works. There's a shift in council. It would be sad to see that go if new faces are on the council. I just wanted to see what you, if that's interested of you, or the funding for it would be actually there for that.
I'd like to learn more about that and ultimately understand. I see a service like that and I see it at the same time, and I think about the importance of Metro Health, right? To making sure that people have adequate public health to make good decisions in the interest of their overall health, but most certainly in their reproductive health. It's very clear since the abortion ban that we have seen 2022 was the first year we saw an increase in teenage pregnancy in our state, the first time in 15 years. So the fact that we are backsliding on some of these things, and I think that's really important for our community because the numbers are clear that it's young Latinas that are driving that increase in teenage pregnancy. And oh, by the way, if you looked at a map of where kids aren't reading at level and where their math skills are not at level and where you're seeing that increase in teenage pregnancy, there's kind of an overlap, right? So I think it's really important that we are thinking about this resource in the context of public health. I would, and that's, I think, a really important role for the mayor to be clear in articulating the ways in which, some of the changes in laws and policies that disproportionately impact and certainly an already vulnerable part of our community is exacerbating the need for more resources in our community that we already don't have enough of, right? We're not yet fully funding pre-K for SA, right? We have not expanded Medicaid in our state, et cetera. So again, these are things that are worth a more, I think, wholesome discussion beyond just the nursery, though.
You mentioned abortion, so here's a question from the survey. You obviously filled this out, but it's good to ask too, just to hear a more thoughtful answer. So, in light of Texas's near total abortion ban, Do you think the city should fund either directly or through a nonprofit indirectly out-of-state travel for abortions?
I think if we can help rape and incest victims, we should help rape and incest victims. Look, I mean, that travel fund is $100,000. Our budget is $4 billion. That would be like if I just blanked on your name because in my mind I call you Brodesky, but that'd be like Brodesky if you had $4,000 and I asked you for $1, right? So look, and I think again it is almost ironic when we have some of these discussions about multi-billion-dollar publicly financed things, but then we're going to nickel and dime people on helping a rape and an incest victim, right? To get health care that is not available in our state.
What about the concern that while it's a small amount of money, it could result in millions of dollars in litigation?
That's why we have lawyers.
It's just worth the expense.
Lawyers can. I'm not a lawyer,
right.
but I think we have to meet the needs. We have to, I think, address the very real concern in our community, and helping rape and incest victims is not where I'm going to save a nickel or two.
Okay. In the Spurs arena, we've talked about it a bit, right, with Project Marvel.
Yeah.
Do you think the city has a role in funding a new arena downtown?
I think we've got to. Well, look, I think we've got to look at the whole deal. Right? Like, let's look at, again, if there was a small fraction to pay in light of something, in light of the overall deal, I think this is the real challenge, though, is there's not nearly enough numbers. The pictures are great, by the way, but there's not nearly enough numbers in terms of who's paying for what, and what is the ROI. And look, I just keep thinking about what Nelson said. We were supposed to get 20% each year of their profit, and we got 0 over 20 years. I think it would have been very helpful to know that in each of the 20 years we were getting shorted, by the way. But making sure we've got a deal that is enforceable, and we've got some minimum understanding of what the city understands that they're going to get and benefit as a result of that. I mean, that can't be something that is just for tourists. That can't be something that is that the vast majority of our community cannot enjoy, right? In light of, look, when I go to these neighborhood associations, I was just at Tanglewood, they still don't have drainage, right? They're still the very real needs in their community, and the idea that public dollars may be used for something, again, in light of the track record and in not a lot of details about who's paying for what. I think that the jury is still out on what makes sense there in light of we need more information.
But I mean, just like speaking more holistically, or in terms of your own kind of political philosophy, is there any role for public funding in that arena for city funding?
I think again, I think it comes down to the deal that we would get, right? I mean, if you're going to tell me I'm going to give you $1, you're going to give me 100 back, sounds great. But if that's not the deal, if I'm going to give you 100, if I'm going to give you $1, you're going to give me 75 cents, like that doesn't make sense, right?
What if?
I think we've got to look at this generational investment in terms of our generational challenges, right? Spurs, you want to help us pay for our pre-K for SA program? Call them Coyote kids. I don't care, right? We've got an opportunity to pay down on some real needs in our community. So why wouldn't we do that?
Sure. How real would you consider the concern that the Spurs would move to a different city without an arena?
Look, here's the concern that voters have raised with me at neighborhood association meetings, and this was really right around when Luca left, or not left, unfortunately was traded, right? Mm-hmm. So Luca was traded, and then unfortunately Pop, wasn't doing too well health-wise around that time, and that's also when you started hearing a little bit more about Project Marvel. So I think folks are really kind of looking at all of this in context and saying, okay, wait, are we making this, multi-billion-dollar investment around a franchise player? And Wemby's great, and we love the Spurs, but what if what happened to Luka also happens to him? And what if what if other things change, and the circumstances change as to where this isn't the deal that we thought it would be?
Are there any components of this proposed sports and entertainment district that you would support, or components that you would reject and say the city should not get involved?
I think we need to see how this is ultimately going to benefit the city. We haven't seen that exactly in the numbers and cents way that I think an average person would make any decision, right?
Well, how would you, just give me a sense, how would you assess the baseball agreement that that was reached between the city, the county, SAISD, and the missions.
I commend and I told them this, I commended the school district on their negotiating. They actually got something, right? They got affordable housing. And I think that's also really important because in talking with the school district, while there's not I think it's relative, but they will say the number one way that the city could help SAISD and to prevent future schools from closing is with affordable housing, right? So people can live in that area, not only the students and the families, but also the teachers, right? So to prevent the depopulation of these communities, affordable housing is quite critical to that. I think it remains to be part of this question with each of these things, whether you're talking about the AT&T Center, whether you're also talking about the Mission Stadium on the west side, is, okay, now what happens to those facilities, right? I mean, obviously more significant with the AT&T Center because everyone can look at the Astrodome in Houston and see that's not something that we want in our community. I think we also have to be realistic, though, about what would likely go there. Is it really believable that like a Gaylord resort would go there? I don't know if that is true, right? I don't know if, especially in this economic climate, if there are folks waiting in the wings to spend hundreds of $millions on something like that. So I think we have to know more about what the deal looks like. Certainly make sure that communities that were promised something when these things were built there and use publicly financed resources for those, that we have a good plan that doesn't leave, frankly, eyesores in communities.
What's your position on the use of tax increment reinvestment zones and the city's current push to really extend and redraw some of these zones boundaries, specifically for zones that they've proposed using to fund Project Marvel? I mean, do you support these zones, or do you think that there should be limitations placed on either how long they should exist or what they should be used for?
I think, to your point, I think it is important that there are some limitations on how long they are used because it's not a slush fund, right? When you tell people you want to make an investment, I think once that investment is complete, you should have to go back to people to explain to them or actually make an ask again as to why you want to use those resources for something else. I think that's really important. I think I'm also, quite concerned, and even with Project Marvel, you want to make sure that, the money coming into the general fund is sufficient to cover even just the public safety costs of some of these projects. I mean, having worked in national security, that's a large footprint. And so, the police will tell you already they're hundreds of officers short. The firefighters will tell you they're 15 substations short already, right? And so, looking at even just the public safety costs of these things and what is expected to come in for the TERS, we should not make assumptions that that's enough. Because if we make assumptions and it's not enough, then you go further down into the general fund, which is already paying public safety to the tune of $1 billion, right?
I can keep going, but
I actually have a question. On the Asian American Forum on Saturday, a couple of times you referred to minority contracting, but you never got a chance to really elaborate on it. So I was wondering, are you satisfied with the level of minorities getting contracting, minority people of color, women? And also, how will that conflict with the time we are in right now? I'm sorry. How will that conflict with the time we are in right now when it comes to DEI? Do you worry about any kind of clash with not just the federal government, but with Abbott and Paxton?
So I think it's important, even as the laws change, you can always look at the data and understand and help the city and, frankly, everybody in the city understand the impacts that those are having, right? What I was mentioning was the Zebeda Disparity Report that showed that and it was at the Asian American Forum, which is why I highlighted the statistic, which was the fact that, despite our very robust AAPI community and their businesses, 0.1% of city contract dollars go to AAPI businesses. I think people were shocked to hear that. And so, certainly what I would do as a mayor is I think you've got to always look at the data and ask questions, because I think people were shocked to understand it was such a small percentage. And certainly that report points out, where some other numbers are a little bit out of sync. But looking at the data to understand who is getting the contracts ultimately, who hasn't. And while I am, thankful that the goals will remain, I mean, the fact that, those points that are now removed make it harder to meet that plan. Right? And I think of that again in the context of where as a city do we want to go and what ultimately will some of those projects look like. So for example, when I sat down with the head of Centro, right, they talked about the plan for the Central Business District where 75% of the storefront businesses downtown, they want to be local small businesses. And I asked, well, what is that number now? And they said it's like less than 40%, right? So I say that because we've got to look at where we are now, what we have said as a city and a community is our goal, and now what is actually the plan to do that, right? Because having goals and that are never achievable it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in the folks that you have communicated these to and then have not shown how you're actually trying to meet them, especially when you understand, some of the requirements, and I think actually the moderator mentioned the impact of the RFPs, right, and how some of that constrained certain companies' ability to be competitive for those when it sounded, based on his opinion, those weren't necessarily needed, right? So that's what I would take a hard look at, because again, we've got to make sure that, it's not just about, hey, I had outreach here, I did outreach here. At the end of the day, folks are going to be looking at the results as they should.
Do you think, when it comes to public safety, earlier with the downtown project, Mark, we were talking about the public safety expense. You've mentioned some of the shortages, obviously, for police and fire. When it comes to public safety spending, do you support a cap on overall public safety spending of 2/3 of the general fund?
I'd want to look at. In general, I don't support arbitrary caps. I want to make sure we are being smart about the money that we are investing. I think with increased technology, with increased practices, and applying lessons learned from other communities, we can always be more efficient, more effective. So for me, it's less about a cap, and it's more about, hey, are we having a wholesome conversation and discussion and reviewing the ways in which we're actually spending these resources.
Okay. I'm going to read a sentence to you. I'm just curious. So the question really is how this sentence aligns with your view,
okay. This is like that butterfly test or something?
I think this would be a pretty easy
okay.
So here it is. The city is not cooperating enough with the Trump administration on immigration. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? The city is not cooperating enough with the Trump administration on immigration.
I mean, it's not clear what is the gap. I mean, is there an example where our police officers are not following the law? I don't think so.
Yeah. It's a point.
It seems like an opinion versus you could also just look at the facts. And I personally am not aware of an instance where our local law enforcement has not complied with state or federal law.
Do you support Governor Greg Abbott and Texas legislature's efforts to curb the power of local governments or bring regulatory constraints? They would argue they're addressing a patchwork of local regulations, of course.
No.
Okay. Which past San Antonio mayor do you think is most effective?
Oh, good one. Most effective. Let's see how I want to define that.
Who do you admire the most?
Yeah.
Or whose governing style do you admire the most?
Whose governing style?
Yeah, if you had to pick one past.
Oh, it's got to be a San Antonio mayor?
Yeah,
I was going to say somebody else, but okay.
That also.
Yeah. Let me answer the latter. You know whose governing style I like? Governor Whitmer in Michigan, because she is addressing needs in her community. She is going after infrastructure, but she is also making sure that kids aren't hungry, right, in schools, that there is a path, a very clear path, a really solid public education system. I mean, look, Are there going to be areas where I think it is possible to collaborate with the governor? Absolutely. That San Antonio, the Economic Development Finance Fund. You want to bring businesses here. You want to make sure that San Antonio is known for space-related manufacturing. I'm your person. I'm happy to work on that with you, right? San Antonio is the 21st largest manufacturing exporting region in the country. I don't think folks recognize that nearly enough. 5% of our workforce is in manufacturing, 3 to 4 billion just in payroll. So I would want to work with South Texas Business Partnership, certainly our chambers, and certainly the state. How does San Antonio go from 21 to 17 to 15 to 12? What is that plan over the next 10 years, right? So we can really captivate that market. We're happy to work on that. And that really, I think, leverages how we can uniquely tie into some of the other economic sectors that are in the area and in the state, right? But I will also let you know, again, about the ways in which these changes in reproductive laws, et cetera, are hurting and constraining our ability to grow as fast and in the way that we would like to. Because there's only so much you can do if doctors don't want to come here. There's only so much you can do if they don't want to train here, right? So we need doctors, we need medical staff, we need people to have the information to make good decisions about their reproductive health, and we can't ignore that. So that's where I am on that leader. I think locally, look, I think Julian did a good job. I think he had a vision for what downtown could be, right? And understood decade of downtown. Like, yeah, it's not going to happen overnight, but you have to be thoughtful and have a plan and work with folks to do that. I would be focused a little bit more narrowly, though, in making sure that we were, when we make those investments, for example, in downtown, we were looking at the right mix of housing. The right mix of public transportation, the right mix of all these other things that really make our city a great city, but can improve the quality of life for so many.
It's interesting, because you had said that your top issue is housing affordability.
Yeah.
A lot of people attribute the decade of downtown as fueling a lack of affordability, right? Because these tax breaks were for high-end projects.
Well, hence my point of wanting to narrow it. So the point is, I admired the idea of, this is what we're going to do. We know this is not going to happen overnight. This is our plan to address that. I think some of the things, the enforceability pieces, were not necessarily adhered to, and I think initially was understood, right? So, these entities, these projects where they got the property tax bill written off, but yet that percentage of affordable housing isn't what everybody thought it would be, or frankly, the rate of affordable housing also wasn't so not only percentage of all the units, but also the price point at which they were renting to people as affordable was also not, I think, what people had in mind, right? So I think, you got to have a plan. I admired his plan, but I think the enforceability piece and the tracking of the execution is where I would look forward to making sure we're making progress in those ways.
I kind of have a couple of thoughts. One was, I know a buddy, a friend, who's a retired general, and he recently thought about running for Matt Gaetz' seat in Florida.
Oh.
It was pretty interesting because a buddy of his decided he wanted to run for it, and so Mike let it go. But being a commander in 2 war zones really changed him. It made him think about doing something other than serving in the military. It made him think about running for office. Did your time in the military do that? Did your time in the war zone do that? Did it influence your decision to run for office?
My decision to run for office in 2016 was informed by President Trump's agenda and the way in which I saw that firsthand executed. Those of us that have served, and frankly also civil servants that take the same oath to protect and support and defend the Constitution, I think were very taken aback, let me just say that, by the way in which there was a demeaning of people and a real lack of appreciation for not only the importance of good government, but also the importance of American leadership. Right, and how important it is. Frankly, the world is less safe when America is not leading. That's just a fact. and the ways in which folks that were brought in at the time that I saw firsthand were not interested in the public nor service, much less public service. And then also, frankly, just having a deep understanding of how fortunate I am as a person, having lived the life that I lived. My mom came to this country as a domestic helper. She graduated from the #1 university in the Philippines, but wanted a shot at the American dream. And so that is the cloth that I am cut from, reminded us every day that we were lucky, not smart, lucky to have been born in this very special country. We'd have to give back. It's why I served. It's why my sister serves in the Navy to this day. So I think for those of us that understand the importance of the oath that we take and have taken several times in the course of our life to support and defend the Constitution, when we saw somebody that was willing to frankly not honor that oath, and we are seeing in more recently active approaches to do that and frankly weaponize the public offices, as well as politicize an institution as revered as the Department of Defense is just, I think many of us know the moment in time that we're in. We also understand the key role that local government will play in making sure that people are still well served. And that's ultimately what informed my decision to step up and serve in a different way.
And when you came in to the #2 job,
Yeah.
did you have a set of priorities that you wanted to carry out, or basically a sense of what you wanted to do in that job?
Look, as the #2, your job is to make the #1 look good, right? I mean, anyone who has served, anyone who's been a teammate knows that's what that works. And Secretary Kendall had a very clear idea of what he wanted to accomplish as the secretary, and as a faithful deputy, I worked to execute that. I also, though, was very cognizant of the fact that when I served in that role, I was the first woman of color to serve in that role. I was also the first out lesbian to serve as the undersecretary of any military department. First woman of color of any first female woman of color across any of the military departments as the undersecretary. And so, SIG, my leadership has always been shaped distinctly by my time as a young cadet and as a young officer when I served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. One of the very first, it was an ROTC scholarship that took me from John Jay High School to Boston University. And one of the very first things I had to do there was sign a piece of paper that said I will not engage in homosexual behavior, because Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the policy at the time. My opportunity to get an education, my opportunity to serve our country, my opportunity to die for our country, all of that goes away just because at the time there were not enough leaders with the courage to say anybody ready and willing to serve their country should have the opportunity to do so. So yeah, you're damn right. When I was the #2, I challenged myself every single day to be the undersecretary that I wish I would have had as that young cadet, as that young officer. And I think that's really important when we've got a recruiting challenge, right, which we still do to this day. The reality is there are not enough young white men that want to serve in the military. Right? So you have to be a place where everybody who is willing and ready to serve their country feels like they have the opportunity to do so. Not only is it a numbers game, but it is also, as everybody has read any HBR article, right? Harvard Business School article, diverse teams are more successful, right? They're better able to challenge assumptions, better able to come up with different solutions given people's different backgrounds. So I was honored to serve in that way. I was honored to knock down a lot of barriers that really stood in the way of people serving to their full potential, as well as address some of the darkest stains, if you will. For example, I fundamentally changed how we now support survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Changed the policy so that women had greater agency in determining when they continued to fly. Again, understanding that's a key path for our General Officer Corps. As well as, and frankly, even here at Lackland. I was actually speaking at my sister's graduation when she was a drill instructor there. I was the guest speaker, and they were taking the oath, and I was folks were taking the citizenship oath. And I was surprised. I was like, I wonder if we do that. And so I went back to my folks and they said, well, we've been looking at that for several months. And I was like, well, let's do it because the Navy's doing it, right? You graduate on a Thursday, you take the oath right at that ceremony, if not the day before. So was honored to bring back that program, a program that unfortunately was not active based on the Trump administration. But when you look at now the folks that are going through Lackland, you graduate on a Thursday, you'll become a citizen the day before, and I think that's a great program. I hope it continues.
So you did run for Congress twice, and
That's right.
I'm wondering, what have you learned from that experience that you think will be applicable and beneficial to your vying for being mayor?
Well, I think, beyond that, I would argue my time having led 600,000 folks, having managed a $173 billion budget, everything from, managing the organization, engaging with the Hill, telling your story about, why advocating for resources. I think all of that is going to be applicable, certainly, in this time, given some of the city's challenges and threats to funding.
You can't do any of that unless you're elected.
Yeah. Oh, are you talking about the campaigning piece?
Yes.
Ah, okay, sure.
Yes.
Well, look, I think, at the end of the day, I think you have got to make sure that people understand what you stand for, right? And that you have a plan to get things done and can deliver. And I, again, have a record of delivering results. I've got the leadership and management experience. We're working very hard, talking to as many voters as possible. I think we've already knocked on 25,000 doors. And then certainly the plan. I think people have been very encouraged with, the things that I have highlighted on that 100-day plan, right? These are the things we can get after, not 6 months, right? Not word salad either. This is the questions we should be asking so we can have a more fulsome discussion about our investments and our opportunities and challenges. And I think people also get, the urgency, right? Urgency in a number of ways. Traffic, congestion, construction projects. As we're thinking about the upcoming bond, I think it's really important that we look at the completion rate of the previous bonds. And I think people would be surprised to see some of the completion rates not where one would expect, right? So I think we're very encouraged by the reception thus far and the progress, and we'll continue working hard.
I do have one question if there's time. I'm curious how you see the relationship between the mayor and the city manager, and what you make of city manager Eric Walsh's performance.
I think the relationship is BFFs. Just kidding. Look, you're key partners. You're partners, right? You're partners, but the city manager does work for the city council. How do I understand the relationship between the two? I'm not. I just know what I am reading. I less concerned about the relationship per se. More concerned I would be with what is the data showing me about the progress we are or are not making on these things that we said we'd be working on.
We'll wrap there.
Great. Thank you.